Okay, welcome back, and welcome to anyone who's just joining us. So for anyone who's just joining us, the papers in this volume are taken. The questions in this panel are taken from the papers in our forthcoming volume, edited by myself and Professor Govinda Bambra, on Imperial Inequalities, Taxation and Welfare across European Empires. So just to plug the volume again. So this panel is called Welfare, Taxation and Resistance, and it looks at the ways in which colonial forms of taxation were devised, negotiated, and indeed resisted. So this aims to complicate our historical understandings of how imperial states were financed and constituted. So many of the themes that you'll hear in our panel today touch on the previous panel, particularly concerning the ways in which the formation of imperial states was an outgrowth not just of the wealth of colonizing countries, but in fact comes from strategic uses of poverty. So as with the last panel, we're going to see examples from across different empires, the Spanish, the British and the Dutch, and in each case looking at how taxes were negotiated and devised. So just a reminder to the panelists, we have between 8 and 10 minutes for the presentation, followed by a period of 40 minutes for questions. So we're going to take all of the papers together, followed by questions which you can place in the chat as we're going along. So the first paper that we're here is by Mia Rodríguez-Salgado from, he's an Emeritus Professor at the Department of International History from the London School of Economics and Political Science. And her paper is on the economic and spiritual capital, the contributions of early modern Galician emigrants to America. The next paper that we'll hear is by Andrew McKillop, who's Senior Lecturer in Scottish History at the University of Glasgow, and his paper looks at poverty and health and imperial wealth in early modern Scotland. The next paper is by Camilla Salleh, who is a PhD candidate at the European University Institute in Florence, and she's looking at Imperial Hospital, the Hospital de las Naturales de Potosí, and the mediation of charitable transactions between the 16th and the 17th centuries. And finally, we have Yvonne Tan, who's a master's student at Goethe University in Frankfurt, and she's looking at collaboration, coercion, and counteraction, British centralisation policy, and 19th century tax revolts in Malaya. So thank you. Now I'll hand the floor to Mia.
Thank you very much for the invitation. And let me just explain that my concern is with a region of northwest Spain, the region of Galicia, which shares a frontier with Portugal on one side and has an extensive Atlantic coastline and with the Bay of Biscay in another. And its geostrategic position is an important element in this study, because it became a byword for emigration, particularly emigration to America from the 18th century onwards. And yet it seems not to appear, or hardly to appear, in the course of the first 2 centuries of exploration and settlement in the Americas. So my first sort of question was, why did this happen? And I was also interested to investigate what it means for a region that doesn't seem to be taking much part in the process of expansion, of colonial expansion. Does that mean that empire has very little or no impact upon its development? Now, in trying to answer the question of why Galicians didn't seem to figure very much at all in the first 2 centuries of expansion, people tend to resort to kind of socioeconomic aspects. This was a region that didn't have excess population. It has a fairly stable social system with deeply embedded welfare structures, such as seed banks and patterns of almsgiving that facilitate survival. There was seasonal labor with other parts of Iberia that tended to supplement income as well. And in the 1570s, the king actually asks Galicians to go and populate the southern rich lands in Iberia where he had expelled rebels. And Galicians are notorious for their sort of reluctance to leave their homeland. Now, all of these played a part, undoubtedly. But my argument is that it's much more important to look at crown policy to explain the exclusion of this region. And it brings us to an important aspect of colonialism, and that is the way that governments throughout history have used their power in order to decide who, if you like, benefits from this process. From the 1490s, the Castilian monarchs essentially create a monopoly of trade and indeed of the movement of people to the Americas and later Asia. And they focus it on Seville and Cadiz initially. Now, this is partly for geostrategic reasons, but in fact, it's a much more sensible thing to do to use two ports, not one, if you're going to have regular trade routes to Americas. And the other obvious place is, in fact, Galicia, because of trade winds and so on. So why go for Seville? Well, at the point at which you have the so-called discovery of the Americas in the 1490s, Seville was an obvious area where they would find three absolutely essential things. Investors, number one, shipping, and manpower. Now, the crown didn't have funds or the inclination to pay for imperial expansion, but it was more than happy to acquire both sovereign rights, lands, subjects, and further taxation from the process. So what they decided to do for the Americas, as they had done for North Africa and would do for Asia, is to organize a system of contracts. It is a contract between the crown, which claims to embody and represent the state, the community, the whole compound monarchy on the one hand, and investors. And earlier on, there was some debate as to whether this amounted to a commercialization of sovereignty and whether this is a kind of public-private partnership or indeed a private-public partnership. I think it's a way of monetarizing sovereignty, because what the crown does is to license, legitimize, justify expansion and wealth extraction, and in order to attract investment, alienates sovereign rights, albeit for a limited period. So the investors are empowered to do things like allocate lands, draw wealth through taxation or exploitation. And in a sense, the crown is, if you like, another investor, but on a much longer term, because they're going to both take taxation out of this process, but also in the long term recoup or establish their full power over these regions. Now, the investors are the ones who undertook the voyages at their own cost and risk. They pay for absolutely everything. And what we have is a combination of different types of investors. The ones who provided most finance are the international banking consortia. In the case of Seville, there was already a very important established Italian community. What they do is they collaborate with another sort of important group of noble or elites who provide a mixture of capital, of, if you like, of passive investment, but also active investment, because this is also the group that traditionally will lead the expeditions, will hold some of the most important offices. And then there were the active investors that have no capital, the mass there of soldiers, of settlers, and so on. They provide the effort. They have to be often maintained and helped to go there, but they hope also for some additional reward once they get there. And I think we really need to put that "and" in. Once they get to America or Asia, what they also rely on is another group, which is indigenous people who allow them, who are the key to the mass expansion that we see. But whether we can actually put them as investors is very dubious, of course, because, but in some ways you can, because you could argue that certain groups collaborate in order to recoup land that they'd lost or to increase their own properties. So this is, it's very complicated, but you have to put them in because it is not just the Europeans who manage this process of expansion. Now, briefly, in the 1520s, the government opens out from Seville and allows other ports to trade, and Galicia takes full advantage of this. So whatever the socioeconomic reasons, Galicia was in a position and could take part in imperial expansion, partly because German and Netherlandish banking consortia come in and are interested in setting up in competition to the Italians down south. But in the end, the crown closes it back down to Seville. There are very good reasons why actually having only one center works very well for the crown, but I haven't got time to go into them. Let me just say a few words as to what sort of Galicians go to the Americas. What have I been able to find out? First of all, that there were more Galicians than we've allowed for, but a lot of them go via Portugal or in illicit trade routes, and therefore they don't figure in the normal government records. The pattern of migration, though, very much follows the kind of migration patterns for other areas. Single young men are the most common group, mostly as servants or in military capacity. There are relatively few women. Again, they appear mostly as servants or as wives of some of the settlers. There are clergy. We have no idea about the numbers involved, just that there are some quite outstanding figures amongst them. There are relatively few government officials, and part of the reason is that they were already excluded within Spain from taking part in the areas, the colleges that train most of government officials. And there are very few high-ranking officials such as viceroys and governors, which reflects the very limited number of Galician aristocrats in this period. Now, what there is quite a lot of, it seems to me, is second rank or middling nobles. This category is really important, and I'll want to dedicate the last few minutes I have to them. It's a group of second sons, members of cadet branches who have the status, noble status, but really not a great deal of money or land to be able to live as their status demands. That group is very keen to go over to America. They have an advantage that the distribution of gains from expansion is uneven. The inequality isn't there by accident. It is enshrined in tradition and in law, which explicitly benefits them. As one of the contracts in 1535 between the crown and the investors say, the commander was not just empowered, he was ordered to, I quote, give and allocate houses and lands, and this includes rights to Indian labor, that are appropriate to the individual, or literally convenient to their person. Effort was rewarded, but what mattered most was rank. So, for example, according to the royal ordinances of 1513, caballeros, that's a term that means both cavalry and a noble, because owning a horse or horses was a real sign of nobility. These they had to be given 5 times the value of land or rewards that a common soldier or somebody who fought in the infantry were given. So this is partly in recognition of the way that this group tended to join the campaigns. They tended to pay their own way. They tended to work to use their own resources, and then after a number of years they would claim for their reward. And so what we have here is definitely inequality not equating with equity, which was an element that was being discussed, earlier. Equity, in fact, meant reinforcing a system of inequality, and we can see the way in which the expansion and colonialism, in fact, is used as a way to reinforce the social hierarchies within Europe, replicating them, but also reinforcing them, because you get out of Europe this group that could not live like nobles, that would perhaps undermine the hierarchical system, and can actually be given positions and rewards in the colonies that enable them, in fact, to reinforce their status. And I've run out of time, but just very briefly, want to highlight the fact that in my paper, I will discuss the benefits as well as the drawbacks of what participation there was from Galicia in colonial expansion, particularly in America, and that I explained that there were benefits because even quite small amounts of money that came into the region were absolutely vital in a region where it was very difficult to monetize wealth, and that a lot of the funds, even small quantities of funds that came to Galicia, were actually used in welfare provision for the church, for the poor, and so on. But for now, I think I'll have to end there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mia, for this really fantastic presentation, giving us far more detail on how the Crown monetarized on sovereignty and legitimated its wealth extraction. And I think this issue that you've introduced around contracts and status is particularly important to our thinking about concepts of justice and how it changes over time. The point that you make that inequality was not an accident, but rather enshrined in law, is, I think, something really important that we need to reflect upon. And it also introduced this important spatial dimension, rethinking perhaps our notions of centres and peripheries. Now, I remember when we framed this project, somebody commented on the project looking like a rethinking of world systems theory, and this issue of centres and peripheries, as I know a theme will come back to in Andrew McKillop's paper. So now I'll hand over the floor to Andrew McKillop. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Julia. First of all, before I begin, could I thank the Tax Justice Network and Gurminda and, of course, my colleague Julia for inviting me into this. And as a way of introduction, yes, you don't get much more peripheral than early modern Scotland in many respects. And it's a story, in a sense, of how a markedly peripheral society negotiates the processes of global imperialism, the wealth accumulations that come with that, with the concept of sustainable national as well as personal health. In a sense, that's the whole point of the paper. I think the paper tries, whether it succeeds or not, it's a different issue, to address, I think, particularly two key questions which both this event and the book more generally addresses, and that is the extent to which the colonial subsidy underpins the development in Europe of either national or local health and wealth provision, and secondly, how issues of capital accumulation and wealth from colonialism both embed existing inequalities, generate new inequalities, and in some ways the paper tries to argue that using the cultural politics of welfare provision in an extremely poor country provides a neat cultural way of, in a way, reconciling some of these structural tensions. So that's the general idea behind using the example of early modern Scotland and some of the bigger themes we're looking at. Scotland is a byword in the early modern period in poverty. It's a very poor country and is understood in itself to be a poor country, and is certainly considered by external observers to be a poor country. I think in that respect, it mirrors some of the issues Mia raised in relation to Galicia. It's suffering, obviously, by the fact that its next door neighbour is one of the richest and most materially affluent societies. But there are major reasons by which that reputation for poverty is being compounded at the beginning of the period I look at. In the 1690s, Scotland suffers a series of mass famines which kill about 10% of the population. Large numbers move to Ireland, which, although also a materially poor country, acts as something of a haven for migrating Scots. There's a reputation both internally and externally to Scotland that poverty produces an umbilical link, both in a very real sense to migration and to the cultural figure of the migrant. The migrant is a negative understanding. It is a symbol of the nation's poor, if you like, material health. So there's already connections between this question of national health and migration. Now, Scotland's solution to this is empire. That the way in which it can materially improve itself, stop emigration, hopefully, the loss of its population, is empire. Scotland therefore attempts a late entry into the Atlantic, imperial and global colonial systems in the Darien expedition, and it fails miserably. Scotland is a very good example of a nation which attempts to go global on a very dodgy prospectus, impoverishes itself, and compromises its sovereignty. I think there's some contemporary resonances for Britain to think on in terms of how it seems to be conducting itself at present. So with empire as a failed solution to national poverty, Scotland rapidly adopts a secondary solution, and that is, of course, union. Scotland negotiates very quickly after its failed empire experiment a highly distinctive union with one of the most successful colonizing powers. And it does so in ways which again suggest that there are fascinating intersections between empire as both a solution to national poverty and as a massive exacerbator of national poverty. The Scots negotiate a series of deals which essentially reflects its highly sectional nature. The landed aristocrats negotiate a low taxation deal within the Union state. Effectively, the Scots perfect the minimum representation for little or no taxation model, as opposed to the Americans who want representation for taxation. The creation of the United Kingdom also involves the first national bailout. The investors of the Darien Company are bailed out at public expense, thus beginning a long and dishonourable British government tradition of bailing out in failed investment strategies, be that banks in 2008 or slaveholders back in 1834. So the nexus between public taxation and public national wealth and finance capital is embedded in the moment of the United Kingdom's conception. But union does give Scotland access to empire, and the result, frankly, is a process of astonishingly rapid globalization by a very small, very poor, very underpopulated country. By any indices you want to take, Scotland becomes, between 1700 and 1750, massively immersed in most aspects of Britain's global empire. Her major overseas trade is embedded in the slavery system in the form of the mass importation and then re-exportation of tobacco. Glasgow is like Bristol and Liverpool. It's a big booming provincial port. The difference being that Liverpool and Bristol never overtake London, either in size or in financial wealth. Glasgow rapidly dwarfs Edinburgh in those league tables. That gives you an idea of how much empire is fundamentally changing the basis, at least, of civic and urban wealth in Scotland. In the army, Scotland is 12% of Britain and Ireland's population, but it regularly supplies a quarter of a third of the officer corps. Again, we're back to some of the comparisons with Galicia, and Scotland is drawing in large amounts of manpower. The Highlands has 2% of Britain and Ireland's population. It supplies 18% of the British Army in North America. That's producing new regional inequalities, in the sense a region that's relying on export of manpower is progressively involved in empire, but in ways which tend to compound its regional poverty. In the East India Company, Scots are becoming excessively involved at the upper levels in the civil service, in the officer corps and the merchants. Now, the crucial thing to spend the last time thinking about here is that you'd think that this trajectory within Britain's global empire and its disproportionate trajectory would produce a confident national discourse around national improvement and wealth. But it doesn't. In fact, it induces nothing short of colonial angst. Scotland is still shedding huge amounts of population. Scots are emigrating in very large numbers. So if the emigrant is an indices of poverty, Scotland doesn't seem to be benefiting significantly because it's still shedding populations. Its most important branch of commerce is linked to Atlantic world slavery, posing major moral questions over Scotland's modernity being embedded in the most exploitative forms of inequality. That's why Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations spends most of its time not vaunting about capital, but actually thinking about the virtuous basis of the market economy. Emigration, disproportionately from the poorer parts of the country, improving the frontier of North America, but apparently at the expense of the improvement of Scotland. So Scotland's society starts to debate the question of, does empire improve a country or does it develop its underdevelopment? And by the 1770s, that's a hugely live debate in Scotland. Now, just to finish off, I want to point out the ways in which in Scottish society, those issues of national wealth, empire, and emigration as a good or a bad thing are sort of crystallized around the new uses to which colonial wealth is put. And it's in this context that the welfare sector provides new ways for these forms of colonial capital to help ease those debates over whether empire can improve or underdevelop a country. I'm going to use the example just briefly of the inflow of wealth from the Asian hemisphere of the empire, which impacts Scotland hugely from the 1750s onwards. To give you a sort of idea of the value of wealth coming back in from Asia, Scotland's two national banks have a capital stock of 2 million. In 30 years, about 300 East India Company officials returning from Asia bring back in 5.5 million. And they're pouring that into land, into estates and banking. But conspicuously, they pour it into wealth provision and health provision. Hospitals, poor relief systems get massive injections of colonial wealth. This is the effect of making that wealth seem virtuous, productive, and conducive to Scotland's national improvement. One small rural parish in Inverness gets a colonial wealth bequest that's 10,000 times its annual poor relief provision. 6 major hospitals are built in the space of 20 years across every single region of Scotland. In other words, through this process of using wealth provision as essentially a cultural arbiter of easing the tension between emigration, empire, and national improvement, the cultural politics of wealth provision become a major way of easing those tensions. So in a sense, what I want to finish with to conclude is that early modern Scotland is a good example of a poor country immersed in global empire that has to deal with the cultural politics of new forms of capital and inequality. And very interestingly, they use welfare provision as new ways of thinking about productive wealth, who's inside the nation, who is entitled to the benefits and protection of the nation. And these are all assumptions which are very live in modern 21st century Britain. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for this fantastic paper, Andrew. I think it's really interesting to have these papers together, Mia and Andrew, for thinking about poverty as a driver for imperialism and the way that in which empire was seen as a kind of solution for Scotland's poverty. But actually what we're hearing from you is that that there's still a need to justify wealth, but perhaps in a different way, not only seeming virtuous, what the wealth can do from empire, but also productive. So perhaps this is kind of a slight difference between the Spanish Empire and the British Empire here. Now, it was also interesting that we've heard about the franchising and the monetarization of sovereignty, and now we're hearing about how empire could actually be compromising sovereignty. So in Mia's paper, we heard about the importance of space, and this was something continued in Andrew's paper here. And now in the next paper, we're going to hear about a very particular type of space, the space of colonial institutions in the Spanish Empire. So now I'm going to hand the floor to Camilla Salleh from the European University Institute in Florence, and she's going to talk about imperial hospitals. So over to you, Camilla.
Thank you. I will just share my screen. Yeah. Okay, so what I will present to you today is a study of a particular regime of taxation planned to finance an hospital of the Spanish Empire. And with this case, this micro case, I'm interested in thinking about how redistribution and in charitable policy designed by colonial authority work or were supposed to work in this world of structural inequalities that characterize the colonial regime of the Viceroyalty of Peru. As Julia remembers, in the society of early modern Europe, charitable policy were to work alongside the norm of distributive justice, which meant to guarantee to each one what corresponds to their status. Authority were willing to organize a charitable transaction accordingly by distinguishing between the receptors. Hospitals were one of these institutions mediating charitable transaction. From the mid-16th century, many of them have been funded in the city of the Viceroyalty of Peru. For example, Lima, the capital of the Viceroyalty, had one hospital for Indians and one hospital for Spanish. However, at that time, many other cities of the Viceroyalty of Peru have just one hospital. And from the 1570s, a set of reforms in the Viceroyalty of Peru aimed to reinforce the royal power against the one of the church. This dynamic includes the information of the Patronat Royal over the hospitals, especially the Hospital for Indians, which means that the king was to be considered the patron of this institution. The hospital, and especially the royal hospital, will have symbolized the relation of protection between the poor and the king, besides being a marker of Christian civilization and providing the communities with spiritual and physical welfare. Yet we still know little about how these hospitals were to be financed at the time. And in other words, who had to pay for charity in this society structured by difference of status, and by which channels these resources necessary to secure the activity of urban hospital were to be extracted. The paper here aimed to explore such question through the funding plan designed in 1575 by the Viceroy Francisco de Toledo for one institution, the Hospital de Naturales of the mining city of Potosi, considering that this case can offer us good insight in how redistribution schemes were designed in the context of imperial inequalities. Moreover, this case seemed particularly interesting to explore the theme of this workshop because this funding plan includes the creation of a new tax called the medio peso del hospital. And what is important here for me is that in Castile at this time, charitable institutions were financed by alms, by loans, but not by tax. And this raises the question of the colonial specificity of such a taxation regime and of the principle underlying such poor relief policy. So to explore such question, I will first say a few words about Potosi and present the tax regime established by the Viceroy. And then I will consider some aspects of the redistribution mechanism embedded in this plan for the hospital, arguing that it corresponds to the imperial policy of differentiation, and it exemplifies a mixed economic regime of charity, juxtaposing tax and private charity. And finally, I will evocate some examples of how this distribution plan designed by the Viceroy was challenged because of the demographic dynamics affecting the colonial society of the Viceroyalty of Peru, and also negotiated by colonial subjects. So Potosi and the story of Potosi and the impact of its silver for the Spanish monarchy and at global scale is a central reference point in the recent historical discussion of the rise of global capitalism. At the beginning of the 17th century, the population of Potosi was estimated to 160,000 inhabitants, meaning that it was more than London at the same time, and including Euro-descendant, Afro-descendant population, but its demography was characterized by the importance of its Andean population. Until 1617, this mining settlement had only one hospital called Hospital de los Naturales, even if, as we will see later, other colonial categories of population were cured in it. This hospital had been funded in 1557, a few years after the settlement of the first Spaniards who rushed from various parts of the empire to carve the silver mountain of the Cerro Rico. During the first decades of the history of this hospital, its financement was based on donation and loans. The main change in this charitable economy occurred during the 1570s with the intervention of the Viceroy Francisco de Toledo, who framed the new financial plan for the hospital. Toledo, at the general scale of the Viceroyalty of Peru, plan and push for the process of reduction, an attempt to concentrate in colonial towns the indigenous population, and as such to reinforce the basis to levy the tribute for men between 18 and 50 years old. Toledo then massively monetized the tribute, obliging indigenous people to offer their products or labor force in the market in exchange for money. One effect was to channel labor force towards the mining center. Meanwhile, Toledo established that the tomin, a fraction of the tribute, was to be allocated to the hospital of each village, of a native village. Yet, in the case of Potosi, this policy was adapted to the local circumstances. The Viceroy based the financial scheme for the hospital not on the tributary system per se, but on the labor extraction structure it just established, the mita. So the mita was a compulsory pay labor system adapted from a pre-Hispanic institution. The mita for Potosi involved more than 14,000 workers called mitayos, who were obliged by the state to go to work from different province and village in Potosi. Each fiscal unit called repartimiento had to provide a percentage of male indigenous tributaries who, under the control of indigenous authority, the captain of mita, migrated to Potosi for 1 year, usually with their family. These workers were allocated to individual Spaniards who exploited the mines. However, it's important to notice that Potosi economy did not solely rely on the mita, but also on the voluntary labor of many Andean migrants who stay in Potosi. And it's on these structural elements that Toledo established the new tax regime of the medio peso of the hospital. So the medio peso of the hospital was in theory, unlike the tribute, a tax per capita of half a peso that each mitayo had to pay per year. The medio peso was destined to the general expenses of the hospital, including the wage of the priest, of the surgeon, of the physician. And the main agent to collect these pesos were the captain of mita, the Indian chief with authority over various fiscal and administrative units. The medio peso they collected once a year was to be deposited in a specific treasury, the Caja de Granos, established first to collect the tribute of the mitayos and another weekly tax called the granos. This treasury was under the custody of an accountant, himself paid from the granos. And this accountant was to deliver to the administrator of the hospital the sum due for the medio peso. At the end, it was the administrator of the hospital who decided the allocation of the sum in the hospital economy. Although he was accountable for these expenses in front of the municipal council and the representative of the royal power. The intentionality of Toledo plans for the hospital was to avoid any expenses from the royal treasury. And from the 1570s, no regular income for the hospital of Potosi came from the royal treasury of Charcas. Moreover, this tax regime was relying on a nexus of local agents, as we see, among them the Andean chief as tax collector, who mediated the relation between taxpayer, the mitayos, and the hospital, supposed to embed the royal protection. The justification of such a tax system by the authority was the idea that this kind of auto-financement was a fairest solution. As far as the hospital was made for curing the Andean worker, it was fair that they provided for him. Yet this principle raised some issue, because not all of the thousands of mitayos who had to migrate to Potosi each year could benefit from health treatment in the some 100 beds of the hospital. And moreover, as far as the hospital was only one of the city, many other colonial categories of population were attending in it. Thus, first, the Viceroy planned an outdoor services to provide remedies to the Andean population living in the neighborhood of the city. And second, as far as the issue was also to regulate the access to the premise of the non-taxpayer, the Viceroy designed a differentiated regime of access to the welfare services, corresponding to different modality of payment for the cure. Thus, he designed what we can call a fractional system of redistribution, structured by geographical, ethnical, and gender difference. Actually, among the patients of the hospital were free and unfree Afro-descendants, Spaniard, and Indios de Servicios, so Indios free from the Indian communities. And it was this variety of colonial subjects that the ordinance was to encompass and to accord with specific economic rights and duties. For this, Spanish master must pay for the cure of the dependent, slave, and indios de servicios, and the price was to be established by the administrator of the hospital. And the same was expected from the Spaniard willing to enter the hospital, in case they did not willingly give the expected alms for their cure. The aim of the ordinance was to ensure that the absence of prejudice for the true poor and sick who should be cured in the hospital, by making pay to the others a fair price of their cure. Actually, the one who should not pay anything for the cure explicitly mentioned by the ordinance was the numerous, I quote, Spaniards, mestizos, negros, or mulattoes will be known to be poor. And even if the ordinance do not precise what does it mean to be poor in this society, we know that in the early modern period, being poor was somehow a freed, rational condition, mostly related to someone's inability to live in correspondence to what was expected from his status, rather than based on a determinate amount of capital. The ordinance entrusts the Spanish administrator of the hospital to recognize the condition of poor and to allow them to be exempted of fees. This ordinance for this hospital designed a multiplicity of mechanisms of redistribution and multiplicity of ways of participating to the charitable economy of the hospital. In this context, the fiscal basis for the taxation regime spread at the regional scale, as we see because of the different origin of the mitayos, but the distribution was thought at urban scale, encompassing a large range of colonial subjects. So once this legal frame established, to which extent the Andean mitayos participated to the funding of this hospital? Because of the absence of the archive from the Caja de Granos and of the archive of the hospital, it's hard to evaluate precisely the value of the income from the medio peso and to trace exactly the redistributive flux. But what we know is at the end of the 16th century, the report about the medio peso evocated that it corresponds to the half of the total income of the hospital, which means that without further royal subsidies, the other part will seemingly have been covered by income from loans, rents, sales of remedies, and alms. And actually, the Viceroy policy never had been to suppress private charity. This means that we have here a mixed economy where taxation coexisted with private charity and rents. And yet, the following decade after the Toledo Ordinance, this tax represented an increasing burden for the Andean community, and this for two reasons. First, because the tribute, the medio peso, was described as a per capita tax, but in practices, it was to be collectively assumed by the community under the responsibility of the Andean chief. And second, because even if the plan of Toledo aimed to correspond to an equitable repartition of the tax depending on the population of each repartimiento, of each fiscal unit, the medio peso, the value of the medio peso due by each community remained constant until its suppression at the middle of the 17th century. And this in spite of the demographic fall down affecting the Andean population caused by disease and migration. There was a disconnection between the tax in one hand and the demographic trend in the other hand, which have for effect to increase the economic burden on the community, and this exaggerating the inequalities at the regional scales. And it's in this context that at least we can know one strategy used by the Andean chief facing this colonial obligation, which was to resort to the real justice in order to obtain the suppression of the taxes. And just briefly, I will evoke one example of this action of the Andean chief, with, in name of the community, represented the interpretation of the takes to the real justice. So, for example, this petition in 1582 of some of the Andean chief of the jurisdiction of Chacas, who wrote a memorial addressed to the king, Philip II, in which they denounce many aspects of the Toledo policy. And they ask for the suppression of the taxes, arguing that they are not using the hospital and putting at stake the difference between the one using the hospital means that differentiating themselves from Spaniards, from slaves, and from other communities. So, yeah, so maybe just some conclusive remark about this system. That the case of Potosi shows that shows the coexistence of various mechanisms of redistribution channeled by the same institution, the hospital, and a redistribution regime that was legally structured by geographical difference, ethnical difference, and social one. It traced a fragmented distributive justice made to perpetuate the colonial hierarchized order. So second, this case of Potosi shows that an history of a tax regime that stood against a linear narrative, who would be the history of a poor relief passing from charity to state poor relief support by taxes. And then the last point is the fact that this tax for the hospital of the medio peso creates a specific connection between extraction of labor forces and welfare system, poor relief, which was quite new in the Spanish Empire and raised the question of a colonial specificity of this poor relief system. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Camille. If you can unshare your, thank you very much, and share your screen. Thank you very much for this really fascinating paper, which introduces the way in which the notions of poverty are changing over time, and there towards in the conclusion there, thinking about the critical overlaps between welfare and charity. And I particularly like the way you started this paper, thinking about how welfare institutions actually played this role in constructing inequality by instituting a notion of equitas to each according to his status. And I think there's also something powerful about this example of the colonial hospital being in the same location as the extractive colonial mine. So you sort of see the tight entanglement between extraction and welfare, but then actually problematizing this this relationship, as you say, of how we think about the history of the welfare state development. And towards the end of the paper, you've talked a little bit about resistance, and that's the theme that we're going to come back to now for our final speaker in this panel, Yvonne Tan. So I'll hand the floor to you now, Yvonne.
Thank you. Thank you, like Julia and Gominda and the Tax Justice Network for inviting me. I'm going to share my slides as well. Can you see it? Still loading, I think. Okay,
yes,
can you
loading.
see it? Okay. Is it okay now?
It's okay now, yes, thank you.
Okay, yeah. So basically, I'll be presenting on two tax revolts in the 19th century Malaya. I think we were talking about world systems theory and about peripheries. And if there is periphery to the periphery, it is these two states, Kelantan and Sabah. So basically, I wanted to kind of compare how British rule differed in two states in Malaysia. Kelantan is part of 5 unfederated states in Malaya. And these 5 unfederated states were given as Siamese concessions from the Siamese government to Britain so that they could retain independence. And part of one of the things that was agreed between British and Siamese, but not the 5 states, was that they had to have a British advisor, and they eventually fell under the advisory system under the Strait Settlements government, which is under the British East India Company. And hence they were indirectly ruled. And I wanted to compare this to Sabah, which last time it was called North Borneo, and it was ruled by the British North Borneo Company, which is a company that only has 1 colony and was directly ruled. And yeah, compare between how extractive indirect rule would compare to direct rule, and if that made any difference at all. So yeah, very quickly, the first rebellion that I looked at is Kelantan Rebellion in 1915. So basically it started with the land tax system being introduced by the 3rd British advisor, William Langham Carter. And not only did he introduce this, but he also introduced a police system. He also created a state treasury. He also divided Kelantan into 5 different districts, and in each district there was a district officer, revenue collector, and so on, many other bureaucrats under them. And this eventually would replace what was called the produce tax. So this produce tax was collected under the first 2 advisors. And the produce tax was only collected in case you had harvest, but in the land tax system, regardless of not whether you cultivate your land or not, you had to pay it. And also this system introduced sort of what we call penghulu kampung, or loosely translated headman of parish. So it also replaced the sort of old traditional chiefs who used to collect produce tax and who kind of let off a lot of people, but now you couldn't, and there was also a registrar. So this kind of ensured revenue will always be given to the colonial state. And yeah, so this angered a lot of people, this caused a lot of hardship. And one interesting thing is that the Sultan and his aristocrats also had to pay this land tax, which also made them really angry and on the side of the rebels in the beginning of the rebellion, until the British managed to kind of reach an agreement with the Sultan so that they don't have to pay tax. And in fact, Langham Carter found this as a point of progressiveness, because it's seen as the fact that even a peasant and a sultan had to pay the tax was seen as progressive. And yeah, in the end, many people joined, took Janggut. However, unfortunately, he was killed in the middle of crossfire. And yeah, the land tax system is basically based on 4 different classes, and the more land you had, the more tax you had to pay. So really, a lot of aristocrats were really angry with this, but in the end, they managed to reach a compromise with the British. And I wanted to compare this with the Salleh rebellion, which is a much longer rebellion from 1894 to 1905. And it essentially started with this man, Salleh, who decided to visit Sandakan Bay together with other village chiefs who were kind of disgruntled by the introduction of new taxes, including rice and poll tax, licensing of boats, village ordinance was passed that undermined the position of village chiefs. So Salleh was a datu, so he was an aristocrat. I think a good way to think about it is that a datu is on the same level as a sultan, but they have social prestige, but no actual power. But a sultan actually has power, but not much really social prestige. And they also protested against the custom stations built on where he lived, Jambongan Island, and a particular officer that he clashed with. And if you want to compare this to the Kelantan Rebellion, the rice and poll tax was actually around for quite a long time in 1886. And the village ordinance was only passed in 1891 to because they realized that there wasn't a structure in order to collect poll tax. So they had to create it, which is village ordinance, and which is the same as Kelantan as well, where basically the role of the traditional chiefs were no longer important anymore. And so it seems that in Kelantan, people were rebelling against a more disproportionate taxation because there was already a tax in place beforehand. But in Salleh rebellion, it seems that as the expansion of colonial administration happened, it seems that the people were sort of protesting against the mere presence of the company. And in fact, the reason why there's so many taxes put in place was because Sabah is very different from Kelantan in a sense that the terrain is very mountainous. So there's a lot of settlements that are very secluded from one another. So for the longest time, even though the company had consolidated North Borneo for, I think, in around 1800s already in the beginning of the century, they only focused on the remunerative trading ports because they were unable to access the middle of Sabah. And hence the managing director decided to come up with a cross-country cross-country road, a railway line, also a telegraphic line. And I think that's very representative of a lot of colonial systems where, you build a railway and people always say that, oh, that's, welfare, but actually there's always some underlying reason why. And hence, to pay for this big projects, they had to come up with rice and poll tax and so on. And yeah, so in comparison to whether direct or indirect is better, regardless of the fact is that these taxation regimes made both of their colonies very profitable, as you can see with Kelantan, in 1910, and then after the rebellion, 1915, 1920, it's more than tripled the amount of revenue. And in terms of North Borneo, you can see that the company has made significant losses before the introduction of poll tax, and it was only by 1895 when the rebellion started that they managed to start making a profit. So yeah, I think in this case, it seems like the indirect way has been more extractive. And I think also in this case, it is kind of important to think about the sort of character of resistance in a sense that, of course, everyone kind of knows that you would get taxed in some sense. Even Salleh himself collected taxes as well as a datu, as an aristocrat. But it seems that there was this huge sort of understanding where even though there was more disproportionate taxation, or even though there was a sort of taxation from a foreign body, there was no sort of increasing of citizenship rights, and hence maybe this in case created a lot of indigenous strife from these taxation regimes. And yeah, and in fact, Tok Janggut and Salleh have become sort of larger than life. They're known as karamats, or sort of like Islamic saints in Malaysia. And even though they're not in the sort of bigger narrative of the whole nation, they're very important in the specific states in Kelantan and Sabah. But yeah, I'm open to more discussion and questions about direct and indirect rule. So I'm gonna stop sharing my screen. Okay.
Thank you very much for this fascinating presentation, Yvonne. It's really important, I think, to have this paper on our panels, thinking about the importance of Indigenous resistance. And I particularly was interested in this notion of the tax seeming disproportionate to the local population, and this prompting resistance. And I wondered if from this I could abuse my role as chair and ask the question to all panelists, whether the question of audience is important across other examples of empire in thinking about how wealth extraction is being justified. So, for example, in Andrew's paper, you were talking about this notion of needing to show off wealth as productive, and also kind of echoing earlier tropes around religion and charity, but perhaps changing more to thinking about the productive notion of wealth. Was what audience is important? What kind of themes are important in thinking about how wealth becomes justified? And are the colonized populations' notions of justice playing a role in this kind of picture that we're starting to build up about why welfare was important in the process of legitimation?
I think there's two ways of looking at that, Julie, and I'll try and keep it as brief as possible. It's certainly noticeable that given the capital accumulation, I'm going to come right out and call it Marxist primitive capital accumulation that's going on from the East India Company's phase of expansion, that there is a huge amount of civic and economically focused charity. But goodness me, it's very heavily focused back in Britain and places in Scotland. Inside their own territories, there's various orphanages, various civic attempts to produce charities inside places like Chennai or Kolkata or Mumbai. But given the scale, it's relatively small. And if there is an audience or a set of groups that these primitive capital accumulators in a colonial mode are trying to influence, it is most certainly back in places like Britain and Ireland, rather than particularly in, say, the company's big port cities. And I think that tells you something both about their lack of concern over the volume of extraction and their marginalization of local opinion.
Thank you very much for this. I don't know if the other speakers want to add anything, or yes, Mia?
Yeah, just to perhaps turn it slightly differently, I think if we're considering how wealth extraction is justified, it might be helpful to look at it in two ways. In other words, how it's justified, say, by the crown or by the state, which in the case of the early modern period, it's about bringing the true face to the heathens and so on, but also bringing civilization to those who are not sort of properly civilized. But I think those arguments also function in terms of justifying an individual's acquisition of wealth, but not only that. I think for the individual, it's a lot to do with what their contributions have been, and therefore whether they deserve, whether they merit being given that wealth or being allowed to extract it. And in that case, I mean, for example, the appeals or the claims for reward from the Crown are very interesting in the language that they use. And it is invariably pointed out that these people have increased Crown revenues, they've increased land, they have contributed to the process of Christianization and civilization as well. But above all, they've contributed to the royal service by their interventions, and including, if you like, contributing to the revenue from taxation. And as a result of that, they merit being able to take these funds. So I think sometimes dividing it into justification at the state level and justification at the individual level. And I think, Andrews, your material suggests a little bit of that what's being demanded, it seemed to me, about in terms of sort of justifying it and using it for welfare, or you know, sort of being productive, is of the individual who comes back with this money, not so much of the state. So I just wondered whether there wasn't sort of that kind of, I can see sort of two levels or two different sort of narratives or arguments going on in here.
Brilliant, thank you very much for this. So we have nearly half an hour remaining for our discussion. So please do keep putting your questions in the chat box if you're in the audience there. So I'm going to look now at the questions that we've had in so far. I have one for Andrew McKillop, I think, and he's asking about whether in Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, there was a moral imperative, where the nature of value is questioned within economics and the role of profit. So I don't know if you can see this question, Andrew.
Yes, I did see it, Juliana. Sorry, I've been mucking up my responses by replying a mixture of private and public, which is to come back to precisely to Mia's point about mixing up public and private. Just to say on that purpose, yes, I think that's a great question. And if you look at the context in which Adam Smith is producing some of his pre-Wealth of Nations work around ideas of law and value, I think the questioner's hitting it exactly. He's in a city which is just literally mushrooming, but it seems to be mushrooming in a way that begs two key questions of the question of national improvement and of a modern commercial economy. A, is it sustainable if it seems to be derived from A, a highly specific, therefore one-dimensional economy in tobacco, and B, as the questioner quite rightly put, in a way very derivative, derived of credit on a huge scale in Scottish terms, and Smith therefore is asking the question of how are we clear on what basis we are evaluating value, and more importantly, will value hold its value as you move it through these ever more specialized derived economies, particularly colonial economies. And part of the working out of the very heavy moral emphasis in Wealth of Nations is frankly his skepticism that certainly human action in markets will be able to do that. So I think, again, that's an example of where the specificity of the Glasgow example is actually influencing directly the way Smith thinks.
Thank you very much for this, Andrew. And this was partly my selfishness in wanting to hear your response to this question. So we have a question from Gominda Bambara, which is very pertinent and relating to the broader theme of the conference on reparations. And it's directed at Andrew again. And she asks, given that the amount of wealth extracted from the East, especially India, was so immense, why do you think it hasn't filtered into the public imagination in the same way that the Atlantic relationship has, for example, with contemporary movements for reparations for the slave trade, for example, where we're both based at the University of Glasgow to invest 200 million this time
I'm conscious that there'll be other questions, so I'll make this quick. And that's a super question. I think comes precisely to the way in which the cultural politics of conceiving of empire have massive, long-lasted, embedded legacies in British society. I think the answer is probably a mixture of the fact that the way in which wealth is conceived in the period I'm looking at, it's partly to do with sustainability and if you like, demonstrability. If sugar is produced on a Jamaican plantation, even if it's done with enslaved labor and it's brutally inhuman, ironically, that seems to have a literally grounded nature. The wealth that's coming back from Asia is on at least as big a scale, but seems to be coming from highly derivative sources, from sort of invisible bonds, shares, the company's use of, if you like, complex financial mechanisms. That, ironically, at the time, leaves that wealth susceptible to a lot of criticism, hence the sort of actions my returning nabobs are doing. But over time, as those forms of colonialism evolve into different forms, it doesn't leave a lasting public consciousness. What instead comes in to the consciousness of populations and society in Britain is through abolition, through, of course, enslaved people making themselves free through revolt and resistance. You get the idea that wealth derived from particular parts of the empire that are based on enslavement are much more morally repugnant. And that, I think, leads into the higher level consciousness and immediacy of reparations issues around, quite rightly, enslavement and enslaved communities and their descendants in these kind of territories now, as opposed to the fact that Britain and certainly places like Scotland could arguably be in a case for giving reparations just as significantly to large parts of South Asia, because the volume of extraction and drain is as significant, at least. But I think it's the cultural politics at the time that helped dictate the embedded aftermath.
Thank you so much for this really clear explanation of this, Andrew. And I think it's a question that we're going to keep coming back to again and again in this conference. You know, global history, we both practice global history here at the University of Glasgow, has often been framed in terms of economic divergence. But it seems to me that we need to look at the multiple moral divergences that underpin this, that mean some practices are justifiable in some places and others are not. And this kind of performativity to and ideological framings of economic practices. So this is very interesting. Thank you, Andrew. A connected question coming again from Gominda, directed at Mia, asking to what purpose the money was put to by the Galician emigrants who sent money back to Spain.
Oh, well, thank you for that, because since I can never function in 10-minute slots, so I left a whole part of the paper that was really about welfare and the uses of this money. It's very difficult to trace what money came back and the uses of it. But what I have found is that quite a lot of fairly small sums, for the most part, and some very large sums were in fact given over to the church, which was one of the reasons that I chose to speak in my paper about spiritual capital, because a lot of both very poor, I mean, everybody from the very poor to the very rich would leave part of their goods to the church, not only to the fabric of the church, to the building and upkeep of churches, but also for maintaining the sort of personnel, the priests, for building convents, for beautifying the church, which was a way of, if you like, propitiating God, and for bringing a spiritual protection for the community. So you provide community spaces, and you provide also spiritual guidance and spiritual benefits for the community through this money. And this was held to be one of those contributions that counted as a common good. So monies were spent on that, and that was seen as something very, very positive that was gained from the empire. However, there was also money used by individuals, and with great effect, even quite small sums of money, tend to make an enormous impact, both social and economic, in a society where wealth was not monetized easily, because most of the wealth was tied up in land that was in entail, or in buildings, or in rents in kind. So the fairly small amounts of money that some of that group of nobles bring back, for example, make an enormous impact upon the local sort of the local economies. But the other thing that I think some of my material is making very clear is that a lot of people chose to settle in America, and those who did then use their money on the provision of both welfare and of building up their own families and their own position within America, and that very little of this was sent back. So you have a very different pattern of immigration and of redistribution of money in this period, as opposed to, say, in the 18th or particularly 19th and 20th century, when Galician immigrants are sending amounts of money regularly back to Galicia. That doesn't seem to be happening so much in the early modern period. People seem to make a choice. They settle in America and they help to create the American society, or else they go back. And the ones that expect to go back will send money back, but just a lot of them seem to have opted for making a new life in America, and that is where they are, if you like, redistributing or using their funds. So at the moment, it's very difficult to say whether, if you like, there is a net gain or a net loss in terms of Galician participation in America during this period, because there are also losses, major losses, in terms of losing individuals who are sort of productive and who are very active, in terms of losing clergy, which by the time of the late 16th century, early 17th century, where they're trying to, in fact, improve the levels of Catholicism in Galicia, they find that most of the clergy has gone to do missions in America. And there's a great outcry against this, because they believe that what they need is for this clergy to be in missions within Galicia itself. So they feel they've been deprived of some of the most productive and active people, both secular and clerical, and that is seen as very much as a sort of a drawback, really, of empire. And just a final point, that one of the difficulties about sending back money in the early period is the dangerous route that you have, unless you come via Seville, and there are escorts then to bring you back, because of the constant attacks of pirates at sea. And pirates infest the Galician coast, particularly English and French piracy, and that actually also, I think, deters people from sending a lot of money back.
Thank you very much for this. And yes, just to add, it seems to me that this kind of investment in these religious and charitable institutions is not only a way of sort of giving away wealth, but in a way it's kind of giving while keeping, this kind of classic model, because they're kind of gaining from social status by having kind of given to the hospital or the religious institution. And it seems to be a way of keeping wealth then in the community. And so this, I think that was interesting also that, you said that it's hard to monetize on wealth in this period, and therefore, finding other ways of kind of creating capital from the gains seems to be going on. I know this this came up in Andrew's work as well, thinking about how people and migration is being sort of effectively monetized in different ways. And I don't know whether Andrew, in your work, you see when people are investing in welfare institutions, do you see this as a kind of giving away of wealth that then, or is it actually that the person is getting back, is kind of is maintaining wealth in some way through this kind of through the wealth that it kind of gives away?
I think that's probably one of the major ways in which myself and Mia's papers overlap. We're dealing here, And in fact, I would argue Dave Brown's chapter is fascinating at showing the way in which another relatively poor in material terms society is being monetized from a different sovereign center. What me and I look at are the way in which the populations inside those areas are responding and what in effect they are doing. And I think this is important for world systems theories, for great divergence, etc. is what do you do? How do you model in societies that use people as capital and not finance capital? And that is certainly what Scotland does. And Scotland offers a stark contrast with Ireland in terms of at least the connection with India, because Ireland ends up in what I call a low human capital nexus. Ireland sends out very many more people to India in the East India Company service, but they're going in as ordinary enlisted men. The Scots are going in as officers, as merchants, and the result is they carry with them, and I think the way it's going on in Galicia, that's poor Europe's use of human wealth as proxy venture finance. And what they're doing is, in effect, by monetizing population through emigration, you then get, admittedly, as Mia says, mixed returns. But for somewhere like Scotland in 1700, it's a byword in poverty. It's still very poor in 1800, but it's a whole lot richer. And I think that's something which we need to think about in terms of trying to model in Europe's comparative advantages. What if it's not just the comparative regions that have built the fiscal and colonial state structures that give them comparative advantages? What if Europe's poorer regions are compounding that comparative advantage through this sort of tactic? Through, I suspect, the manipulation of the fiscal taxation structures of the colonial states as they emerge. And they may have a comparative advantage because their capital is invested in a human form. I think these are sort of big issues before you even get to issues of resistance and the precise forms of taxation the state uses.
Thank you very much for this, Andrew. And I know you've got a book coming out on this topic. I couldn't remember the title quite to plug it, but if you can put it in the chat or send a link, Andrew's got a book coming out precisely on this topic. And I think this kind of movement between different forms of capital is important to the whole enterprise that we have here over the next 2 days, in terms of how we quantify the gains and legacies from empire, the economic revenue streams of empire. So now we have a question from Alex to Camille, that's also open to all panelists, that says, we know that tax is one of the few things that consistently associated with improvements in governance over time. While imperial taxation was largely or completely extractive, is there any evidence to suggest that the spread and nature of empires may have raised expectations of welfare, whether in colonies or in the capital, and that this may in turn have led to any improvements in taxation and ultimately into improvements in political representation? So this is directed at Camille, but open to all panelists.
So thank you for the question. So for the political representation connected to this question of tax system, for example, the form of contestation of this taxation, which means to write petition to the king, no? To the king in Madrid, make part of these practices of representation. It means that, yeah, it was this colonial subjects adopting the practices of negotiation, of discussion between king and subjects. And this is, but for the expectation of more welfare, so the tendency for the case I'm studying of Potosi at the middle of the 17th century, after years of debates, these taxes of the medio peso is finally cancelled, and it's the hospital, the financement of the hospital became based on this classical mixed economy based on charity and loans. And there is this interesting change, no, in this way of financing, and I not have been able to trace more petition from indigenous population for more welfare, no, but the elite of the Potosi regularly write to the king claiming for king participation in the economy of the hospital. but it's a different game here because it's also a negotiation between these elites, Spanish elites and the king, in a system of rewards. No, of we are the elite. We founded this hospital and we participate to this economy, but we want the king to entering in this economy because in this way is the one who should pay for this hospital because the miners, the Andean miner, are working for the wealth of the kingdom because they are extracting the silver of the mountain. So yeah.
I don't know if our other panelists want to add anything to this. Mia, did you want to add anything?
It's a sort of enormous question. I mean, does it increase expectations of welfare? I'm not sure. I think that the expectations of welfare are in a sense transported, from the patterns that are being used and experimented, because this is a period, particularly in the 16th century, of immense experimentation with welfare throughout Europe, partly because of the growing urbanization and the sort of big debates that sort of humanists are very much involved with at the beginning of the century about how do you deal with Europe's poor. Do you set them to work? Do you export them, as the English decide to do, to the colonies? So there are a lot of debates about dealing with the poor, and in a sense, I think Camille's example is a part of the way that they're experiment with different ways in order that they feel they have to deal with it, that it is part of being a good government to be able to deal with poverty so that it's not purely in the streets and the people aren't starving to death. But quite what the way forward is for this, they're experimenting with. And I think something very similar to what you found, Camille, I think in the hospital Potosi. I mean, I think if I'm not mistaken, that the army, for example, in the armies, soldiers are expected also to make a contribution to the field hospital. So they're partly being made responsible for their own welfare. So I'm not sure that I don't see a connection between imperial expansion and if you like, sort of greater expectations of welfare, because people just do exactly what they would have done or they are doing within Europe. As for whether it improves representation or tax regimes, again, I don't see a kind of an easy connection. I mean, clearly, and you, Julia, will know far more than I do about the situation in the Americas. There's a lot of negotiation, certainly, between the settlers and the crown when it comes to the types of taxation, the allocation of taxation. But it's the kind of negotiation that, again, they were having in Iberia itself. I don't see that there is a great deal of novelty, and what happens in the colonies is what happens with in Iberia, and what I think Yvonne has shown us, that you mess with the tax system at your peril if you include in that taxation regime the elite, because they are going to join with the poor sods who normally pay taxes and whom they're quite sort of willing to help you exploit. But at the moment that you tax them, then a lot of the rebellions that take place are about where the line should be drawn between extraction by the crown for the purposes that the crown wishes to use them for, and extraction by those that have contributed to the establishment of these colonies. So very sort of, I can't say that I see clear links here for you.
Thank you very much for this, Mia. And also just to add this, I guess one of the things that happens is that indigenous and local practices of welfare get embedded within colonial welfare structures as kind of creative forms of resistance and adaptation. That's something we might talk more about in our theme on resistance and so on. I've just realised that we're running short of time. We've got 5 minutes left, and I've just seen quite a few questions pop up. I think there was a delay on my computer. There's a question for everyone here, I think, from Thomas O'Hara, who asks, in his recent work on capital and ideology, Thomas Piketty argued that the great majority of colonial tax revenues were directed towards pay and benefits for colonial administrators, with a much smaller proportion, directly or indirectly, returning to the imperial chancellery. In today's conversation, we've heard about the growth of philanthropy following repatriation of accumulated wealth, frequently achieved via tax exemptions. How are we to understand this, understand contemporary tensions and conflicts in light of the discussions that we've had today? So I think it's not directed at a particular person, but if anyone has any comments that they want to address on this.
I guess I could address about this. Well, I think the immediate example I could think of is because in Sarawak, which is next to Sabah, they have this thing called White Rajas. So basically, there was this man who basically was a British East India Company officer, but he took over Sarawak. And basically, even the Queen said, you are basically still my subject, and I can't recognize you as my equal. And the Brooke family has continued to stay on in Sarawak as sort of this philanthropist, and they continue to channel whatever wealth that they accumulated in Sarawak to continue to build hospitals and so on. And so I guess that is the most clear-cut, direct sort of example of philanthropy, which is mostly with the elite in Malaysia. And yeah, and hence they usually, because they have a lot of ties with the British royal family still, because our independence was kind of negotiated in some sense. And yeah, so I don't think there is a sort of demand for repatriation of accumulated wealth, but definitely still this idea of philanthropy for the people, but never really tied towards colonial tax and demanding for this sort of repatriation. So yeah, that's, yeah.
Thank you very much. And I think, Andrew, did you want to add something to this?
I think that's a great question. And my answer to it is going to be relatively simple in terms of just following on what Yvonne said. What's very striking about the way in which East India Company officials during what we would describe as the early phase of the company's Raj and probably its previous commercial period do is, in effect, in terms of acquiring capital, the acquisition or accumulation phase is national. It's done via national frameworks, but the extraction is privatized. So you have two phases by which, in effect, the company officials are working through the local colonial tax regimes, skimming off profits off public contracts, opium or army, etc. But what they then do is, having used the formal public authority of the colonial state in the accumulation of capital phase, they switch to a privatized mode, and their private fortunes, so they turn public accumulation into private fortunes and remit it, often through the use of another foreign national, the Swedish East India Company, the Dutch East India Company. So in effect, these great British colonial officials are exactly what we'd expect today. They're moving between tax jurisdictions and different national empires to ensure that publicly accrued wealth is extracted privately.
Thank you very much. So thank you to all participants for these fantastic papers and for this fantastic discussion, and to our questions as well. I'm sorry that I didn't get a chance to ask all questions today, but I think that many of the issues being raised will be discussed also in tomorrow's session. So it remains now to say thank you to the speakers, and I'll hand over to the chair of the next session, John Christiansen, who's the chair of the Tax Justice Network, who will chair the next session. So thank you all very much.
Well, welcome to the final session of day one, where we'll be hearing a keynote from Dr. Vanessa Ogle on the topic of decolonization is also a movement of money. As you just heard, I'm John Christensen. I chair the board of directors of the Tax Justice Network, and I was co-producer of a documentary film called The Spider's Web, Britain's Second Empire, which explored how the City of London morphed from its previous role as the beating financial heart centre of the former empire into a global offshore financial centre using its extensive web of satellite tax havens in the British Crown dependencies and overseas territories, and used these territories to extract mobile capital from across the world. Now, as a child, I grew up on the British Crown dependency of Jersey at a period through the 1960s and 70s when very large numbers of former colonialists were resettling on that island. And these former colonialists were coming from countries like Kenya, Uganda, Zimbabwe, Ghana, South Africa, India, which had overthrown their colonial governments and secured independence from the British Empire. Now, many of the former colonialists were very, very wealthy indeed, people who would now be categorized by banks and by wealth managers as high net wealth individuals, henwees, they're called in banking circles. And these henwees brought their wealth back with them, and they arrived in sufficient numbers to transform Jersey in many ways. For example, their incoming wealth contributed to Jersey's development as a tax haven, creating banking links between St. Helier and many countries that were formerly part of the British Empire and beyond. I'm especially thinking about banks like Standard Chartered, Standard Bank, HSBC, and the Bank of India, all of which had large wealth management branches in St. Helier from the 1960s onwards. Now, the arrival of these former colonialists also reshaped Jersey's culture. They formed a new elite, largely detached from other sections of Jersey's society, but they were very politically influential. They used their wealth to buy some of the finest properties on the island. Their sons and daughters were sent to elite schools that are separate from other school children on the island. They were highly vocal in criticizing progressive politics and promoting ultra-conservative attitudes on race, civil rights, and British exceptionalism. So that's the island I grew up on. To put it mildly, they were very hostile also to democracy, especially attempts by the British Prime Minister in the 60s and 70s, Harold Wilson, to tax and regulate British tax havens. Now, for the retreating colonialists arriving in Jersey, the key attractions of that island included the fact that the island imposes a very low rate of income tax, no capital gains tax, no wealth taxes, no inheritance taxes, and extraordinarily low rates of property tax. The island's corporate tax regime exempted companies which were registered in Jersey but not trading on the island, and that perfectly suited wealthy investors with commercial activities in Africa or the Middle East or elsewhere. So Dr. Vanessa Ogle's research on decolonization and the emergence of a global spider's web of tax havens in the 50s and 60s has a very special interest for me, since I grew up and I mixed socially with these former colonialists who moved to Jersey with their wealth and turned that island into a very prominent offshore satellite of the City of London. Now, one of the factors that attracted so many of these British former colonialists who were retreating from Africa and India to Jersey ties in with Dr. Ogle's earlier research into technology change and the globalization of timekeeping. And you might know her book about called the Global Transformation of Time, in which she explores these issues. And I think it was very relevant to Jersey's development as a tax haven, because in the early 1960s, jet aircraft started to fly to Jersey from London, and that reduced the travel time to just 45 minutes per flight. And this technology change allowed ultra-rich elites living in Jersey to fly to London on what was called the red-eye special in the early morning and fly home to Jersey the same night. And conversely, London bankers and lawyers could fly in the other direction, carrying out a full day's work in St. Helier and returning at night. And it's interesting because similar flights went to Geneva. No other destination in Europe, just Geneva. Again, allowing daily flights to and from Geneva. So technology change and being in a time zone convenient to both Geneva and London played a key part in Jersey's development as a tax haven. So I'm really delighted that Dr. Ogle is giving our keynote address on the topic of decolonization is also a movement of money. Dr. Ogle is an associate professor and historian at the University of Berkeley. As I mentioned earlier, she's the author of a fascinating history of time called The Global Transformation of Time, 1870 to 1950. And more recently, she authored a fascinating paper called Archipelago Capitalism, Tax Havens, Offshore Money, and the State, 1950s to 70s. Vanessa, thank you so much for joining us today. We're all looking forward very much to hearing your keynote address. The floor is yours. And can I remind listeners to post their questions to the Q&A channel, and we hope to allow plenty of time for Vanessa to give answers to your questions and comments.
Yeah, thank you so much, John, and also thanks to the organizers for bringing together this really fascinating events. I very much enjoyed listening to the presentations and discussions so far today, and I look forward to tomorrow. It's really terrific to have an entire conference devoted to this, I think, really, really important topic. Thanks to John also for the very generous and helpful introduction. I will say, of course, that when I sort of do my research in the archives, these sort of stories are not necessarily what I find there. In the archives, you see sort of the tip of an iceberg, and you see these sort of hints here and there, but these stories that you related from growing up in this very particular place, you know, give it sort of a different kind of texture that I think is very helpful and important to also include in these stories as much as we can. We can't do it for all sort of instances, but sometimes we can. And I should say that just as a brief addition to your point about technology, the same actually happens in the Bahamas in the early 1960s. So the availability of commercial flights to the American continent sort of has a similar effect on the expansion of business there exactly at the same time. So the technology and communication infrastructure aspect of all this is important. Okay, so what I'll do today is I'll talk about decolonization, and as was said, sort of the relationship of this major period during which former colonies became independent to the expansion of tax havens and sort of the offshore economy, generally speaking. And I do want to say that this is research based on a book that I'm currently writing on the history of the offshore world more broadly, starting in the 1920s and carrying the story of how offshore emerged sort of as a full-fledged system into the 1980s, which is roughly where, for me, sort of things stop. And I should also say that the topic of today's keynote is something that I recently fleshed out in another article that actually just was published in November in the journal Past and Present, where I elaborate on this particular constellation of decolonization and the expansion of offshore. So should you be interested in hearing and reading more about this than what I'm able to present today and say in the discussion, then I'm happy to send you the PDF if you can't access it. If you send me an email, or you can also send me a message on Twitter if you prefer that. Or you can go to the journal's website and find the article there if you have an academic connection that allows you to do that. I'll start by telling you a little bit more about sort of offshore and the offshore economy as a sort of backdrop. So for my purposes, for much of the 20th century and the period that I'm looking at, as you can see up on the slide, the offshore economy consists of 4 ingredients and 4 elements. First, tax havens, which is what I'll focus on today. Then offshore financial, money and bond markets. Something called free trade zones, sometimes referred to as foreign trade zones, sometimes referred to as export processing zones. The terminology varies a little bit depending on where and when you look. These are sites sort of carved out of national territory where taxes and regulation are low, to sort of create, if you want, sort of tax havens within a country. And the last element of this broader offshore economy are so-called flags of convenience registries, which are jurisdictions that allow you to register a ship regardless which nationality you have as the owner of the ship, and regardless what and where the ship sort of carries out business. It just means that if the ship flies the flag of particular jurisdictions, the profits it generates are tax-free or taxed at very low rates. And it also means that labor and other safety regulations are normally sort of much more lax for these flags of convenience ships than for other ships. And I mention these 4 ingredients because, to me, as a historian who sort of works in archives, they are actually they overlap quite a bit. So tax havens were also sites where flags of convenience ships were registered in the 1950s and 60s, where eventually offshore money markets took place. And some places like Panama are sort of all 3. They have a sort of a foreign trade zone. They're also a tax haven, and they also offer ship and flag registration. So while it's helpful to distinguish these different elements, when you look at the sort of genealogy of offshore more broadly, these things sort of overlap and often are 2 or more things at the same time. Okay. So let me tell you a little bit more about tax havens. I very much simplify here for the purpose of keeping this brief and easy to understand. Tax havens are understood as jurisdictions with low or 0 tax rates, generally across the board, or for certain circumstances. They offer easy registration processes, and they normally also provide certain secrecy provisions for the owners of assets. Tax havens in the modern 20th century sense are a product of the First World War and the interwar period. Following the introduction of mass-based progressive income taxes during the First World War, tax havens emerged in the interwar years in Switzerland, a little bit already in the Channel Islands, in Luxembourg, Liechtenstein, and even in Bahamas and Bermuda. During the Second World War, tax havens by no means lay dormant. Rather, European havens such as Switzerland, but also beginning Liechtenstein and Monaco, became places where mostly Nazis, rather than the victims of the Nazi regime, conducted business to evade embargoes, to evade blacklists, and where they basically hid their own assets. And they also became places where, after the war, Nazis basically temporarily fled to offshore themselves and their assets further to places in Latin America and the Middle East, for example. After World War II, again, against the backdrop of increased taxes from the 1950s to the 1970s, havens grew rapidly. And they now expanded in a number of sort of new shelters in Hong Kong and Singapore and Panama, but also business expanded in the Cayman Islands, in Bermuda, and in the Bahamas. And then you have a third period of expansion of offshore that follows roughly from the 1970s, 80s to the 1990s, this time primarily in the Indian Ocean. So I want to show you a slide which captures this sort of geographic division of labor that overlaps with the chronology a little bit. So the first wave of havens is primarily European, and this is where you get the havens that are listed here with the names, and then obviously the sort of geographic detail here. The second period of expansion in the 1950s and 60s features many of these havens over here, the Caribbean ones in the geographic detail. And then in the third phase, you get a sort of geographically more scattered spread where you have the Indian Ocean and the Pacific with sort of additional places that join the tax haven ranks. And the fact that this third period from the 1970s, 80s on happens in a slightly sort of more incoherent and scattered way, as I said, has to do not least with the changing importance of geography and the changing quality and generally sort of availability of means of communication and transportation, something that John alluded to when mentioning flights to Jersey, and that I said was equally also relevant for the Bahamas in the early 1960s. Okay. All right. So in this periodization, in these different phases, the European one, the middle one, and then the sort of final one, the 1950s to 70s were particularly important, as I argue. These decades marked a crucial phase for the development of offshore business for the following reasons. To understand tax havens, we really have to think of them as a kind of ecosystem that comprises a broad variety of actors in multiple sites, not just in the tax havens, but for instance, in London, in New York, in Zurich, and so on. And the proliferation of tax havens during this period from the 1950s to 70s was crucial because it gave this ecosystem time to develop and to become institutionalized. It was time for lawyers to write laws that set up territories as tax havens, time for local governments in tax haven territories to pass such laws, and also in many cases to become involved with tax haven business themselves. And finally, it was time for bankers and accountants to devise and sell products to create an entire avoidance industry involving advertising, specialist publications, and even seminars you could attend to inform yourself about which particular tax haven might be the sort of perfectly tailored option for your tax problem, as it was branded. So all in all, the 1950s to 70s were therefore instrumental to the spread and institutionalization of this offshore economy. Now, when we look at these decades, it is striking, of course, that these were simultaneously the main years of decolonization. And many, if not all, tax havens were current or former dependent territories of some form of the British Empire. So this leads me to ask today, what was the relationship between decolonization and this expansion of offshore business that happened at the same time? In order to investigate this, I want to briefly take us to a number of European settler colonies. These settler colonies were mentioned previously in some of the talks already today. Settler colonies in the British as well as the French Empire around the time of the 1950s and 60s. What did things look like for, in this case, white settlers, colonial officials, and businessmen, say in Kenya, in Rhodesia, in Algeria, or Morocco? At this time, the growth of anti-colonial independence movements was signaling to those who were paying attention the likely end of white rule. Europeans and colonies, especially those who owned land, farms, factories, and other business, began to worry about decolonization and the impending basically change in power relationships. After decades of coercive and violent European conquest and colonial rule, revengeful new leaders might stand to impose taxes and restrictions on European business activity, investments, and capital movements. And worse, these new leaders could theoretically expropriate and nationalize European property without paying adequate compensation. Savvy and well-connected, the better off among these Europeans decided to not leave these matters to chance. Lawyers and bankers in London, Nairobi, and Nassau very eagerly offered their help. And to avoid having to share the wealth they previously extracted from the land and labor of their former subjects, White Britons with colonial investments and other property liquidated these assets where it was possible and sent the proceedings abroad. And this meant that a massive outflow of money from the late colonial British Empire began, a really sort of what you could call a money panic in these years. So I want to show you a slide that lists some of these instances, as I won't be able to go into sort of much detail about all of them, but to just give you a sense of the scope and the kind of time frame that we're talking about of what was happening here. So for my purposes, the story really begins in China and Shanghai in the years leading up to the establishment of the People's Republic of China, when you have an exodus of funds from mainland China and especially from Shanghai to Hong Kong. And this really sort of is the beginning of Hong Kong as a gradually sort of more important financial center. Now, China obviously was not a former colony in that sense, but it was what historians characterize sort of as a site of informal empire, where European and also in that case of American presence had taken on certain characteristics of colonial rule without establishing sort of formal possessions. And some of the outflow of funds here are precisely so from that source. We then get to North Africa and money sort of leaving places like Morocco and moving to Switzerland, also into China, to Monaco. We have oil money and the first examples of that coming out of sort of other parts of the Middle East and the Gulf, and moving to Beirut, which at this point was a tax haven, as well as Switzerland. With the Suez crisis, there's money moving out of Egypt to Switzerland. And very importantly, an event that sort of registers very heavily here in this context, we have the Belgian Congo and its independence ultimately in 1960 and money moving to Switzerland, but also to Luxembourg, where it fuels the expand or sort of the, really sort of the beginnings of Luxembourg as a more significant tax haven. And we then have Algeria to Switzerland, and also in the 1960s, Kenya and Rhodesia, the British settler colonies to the Bahamas, as well as other places in the Caribbean, also to the Bahamas. And these last examples, I'll talk a little bit more about those now. So these funds that left the colonial world with the onset of decolonization did not simply return to metropolitan Britain or France, but rather such money that was disinvested and removed from the late colonial world was often moved to tax havens. This meant that the expansion of tax haven business was fueled by such funds that were departing the late colonial world. In the early 1960s, settlers in the British colonies of Kenya and Rhodesia began sending liquidated assets to the Bahamas and the Channel Islands, thus contributing to the growth of tax haven activity in these places. But as John alluded to in his introductory remarks, often it was in fact the case that former officials, settlers, and businessmen sent not only their money to tax havens, but they decided to settle entirely in such jurisdictions. And this is what happened in the Channel Islands and Jersey in particular in the early 1960s. Later in the 1960s, Malta, which was another tax haven that emerged from the folds of the British Empire during these years, sought to attract these returnees from empire as permanent settlers with special tax incentives. So that's another example of that. Similar developments unfolded in other European empires. In the French Empire, it was above all the sizable settler colonies of Tunisia and especially Morocco and Algeria that sent money to tax havens. Wealthy Frenchmen had for centuries, in fact, relied on the services of Geneva and other Swiss bankers to conceal their riches from paying tax authorities and revolutionary fervor alike. And during the years of decolonization, French settlers and investors in the empire quietly moved their liquid funds to the tax haven of Switzerland. As their counterparts in the British Empire, some former residents of French colonies chose to relocate entirely to a tax haven, in this case, Monaco. The tiny principality had seen some very small scale tax haven activity already during the interwar years, but its real takeoff came in the 1950s, not least as a result of funds and settlers from French North Africa and Indochina. As European settlers, officials, and businessmen pondered where to stash their cash after decolonization, their choices were shaped by fiscal circumstances, both in colonies and also in metropolitan countries like the UK. When colonies became independent in the 1960s, tax rates in metropolitan Britain had reached considerable levels. By contrast, in the colonial world, taxes on white Europeans had, on average, been much lower than, if you want, at home. Settlers in colonies and lobbyists opposed progressive income taxes across the empire as long as they could. And when taxes finally came, Europeans, at least that's what the documents say, proved very adept at cheating. Officials complained about the difficulties of collecting colonial taxes among the white population and often looked at considerable shortfalls and arrears. In the empire, white tax morale was notoriously low. And white taxation, and this is something that emerges much more clearly from Madeleine Walker's work and also, I believe, Lauren's work. White taxation therefore stood in quite sort of stark contrast with the various taxes imposed on colonized subjects. Such taxes reached substantial amounts when taking into account the ability to pay, and they were also often very harshly enforced with the help of violence. So I just want to show you one slide, one image that encapsulates a little bit of this sort of history of a colonial tax morale and reluctance and resistance to taxation among white Europeans in colonies. So this is the cover of a little sort of brochure, an information leaflet that was put up by a society trying to attract settlers to Kenya in the interwar period. I think it's from 1922 or 23, if I remember correctly. And this little booklet says up here, if you might be able to read that, the colony without income tax, as at that point, Kenya was still a place that could claim, as opposed to other colonies, to not yet have income taxes and to sort of offer that as a special incentive and bonus to potential settlers. So in concluding, I want to briefly ask what the consequences of all this were. It obviously fueled the growth of tax havens, which is sort of the story that I mostly focus on in the book, where this is sort of one chapter. But I do want to focus here primarily on the impact this had on low-income developing countries and what it sort of meant for their trajectory going forward in the decades after decolonization. Low white tax morale and the connections forged by departing Europeans to bankers and lawyers in the Bahamas and the Channel Islands and elsewhere in the offshore world settled these newly independent countries in the global south with a difficult economic legacy. The late colonial money panics that descended on European empires on the eve of decolonization led to illegal capital flight on a massive scale. And as a consequence, newly independent countries looking to jumpstart programs of economic growth found themselves in dire need of foreign investments and foreign capital. This, of course, increased the dependence on aid going forward. An even bigger problem, perhaps, was that local wealthy elites in the global south soon discovered the advantages of a Swiss or Bahamas bank account for themselves, meaning the same bankers and lawyers who had previously recruited European tax evaders now turned to political leaders and others holding wealth in newly independent countries. And thereby, of course, they contributed to a sort of ongoing culture of tax evasion and low tax compliance that continues to be a problem. The history of tax havens shows that those seeking to conceal wealth from taxation relied on a very sophisticated operation among various professional groups. Today, many global south countries certainly find themselves held back by low levels of tax enforcement, corruption, and illegal capital flight. But the enablers, the lawyers, consultants, and other white-collar professionals who make up the tax avoidance industry are largely still based in Europe and in the United States. This was no different some 60 or 70 years ago, when late colonial white flight sent European assets to a flourishing landscape of offshore tax havens. And I'll leave it at that.
Great, thank you, Vanessa. And not surprisingly, you phrased a number of questions. So I'm going to go straight to the questions that are still coming in. The first question came from Nigel Munusami, and I'm going to run two questions from Nigel together into one. Is there a moral justification for the existence of tax havens? He asks, are they all about tax avoidance or evasion? So that's part one of the question. And then he asks, would the closing or effective isolation of these tax havens significantly solve our financial problems? Are the sums they shelter too small to worry about? And is our objection mostly moral? So would you like to answer that one?
Yeah, sure. So the moral justification for tax havens, I mean, you know, the people who argue that there is a moral justification for tax havens, they would say, well, you know, they help people who are, for instance, you know, in sort of contexts where they have to fear for their political and other safety. They're being targeted or prosecuted by their authoritarian or whatever, you know, or sort of dictatorial government. And for these kind of situations and people who would face such problems, the secrecy and the sort of possibilities offered through tax havens, you know, are a sort of way to do things that they otherwise could not do, and to also just, you know, shelter assets safely away from the grip of politically hostile regimes. I'm not a contemporary economist who sort of investigates these kind of claims, but there are some people who do sort of look into this, and their work mostly finds that these kind of claims are, you know, they're sort of very thin. The evidence for that kind of you know, being sort of the typical customer and client using tax havens, the evidence for that is extremely thin. From my historical work, I can say that it plays almost no role. So I would say, you know, it's very hard to sort of find a kind of real moral justification for this, certainly from a historical perspective. The question of isolation, or, you know, how to basically, you know, punish tax havens, what to do against them if we wanted to sort of, you know, get rid of some of what these jurisdictions sort of do and are able to offer. I mean, you know, again, sort of, you know, contemporary economists and others do make suggestions for certain things that we can do. You know, they include things as a public registry for ownership of certain assets, so that you can not hide behind anonymous companies as easily as, you know, you would otherwise be able to do. They also suggest certain structural changes in the way taxes are allocated globally, which is especially relevant for corporate taxation, which would also take away certain opportunities that tax havens use. But my sense is that in addition to all these things, which you can do and which are important, I think it would require a sort of, a concerted effort in, different, powerful, high income, wealthy economies such as the United States and certain Western European countries to lean on what I call the avoidance industry, because without also targeting the enablers, I don't think you will sort of fully, achieve what you're looking to achieve with these other measures. And a first step, to do that would be to slap much higher fines on banks and law firms that are essentially caught in the act when, things become public. Recently, there has been sort of a little bit more of that in certain very punctual and individual cases, but across the board, when banks are fined for, misconduct in this area, the amounts that they're made to pay, they sound, large for us, but they are really sort of just the cost of doing business for most of these banks. So it's not something that actually sort of hurts significantly. And I would say that that is something that additionally would need to change. The question of their significance and sort of what is the qualitative, but also more importantly, in this question, the quantitative importance of these tax havens. This again is sort of the domain of contemporary economists who try to sort of put some numbers on it. And, the numbers offered vary a little bit, but I think there's a sort of consensus of sort that would say that roughly 10% of overall global household wealth is stashed away in tax havens. And that's a number that conceals very considerable regional differences. So the numbers are a little bit lower for the United States. They're roughly that as is estimated for many European countries, but they're much higher, for instance, for many sub-Saharan African countries or for places in the Gulf, for that matter, for Gulf countries, and for Russia. There's a correlation that's interesting here with natural resource wealth. So oil and other natural resources, and the kind of sort of political and social fabric that creates leads to very high amounts of wealth stashed away offshore. And we can also say, in addition to simply the amounts of wealth held in tax havens and evading and avoiding taxation, that on the sort of individual level, tax evasion and avoidance is very much concentrated amongst the highest earners. So it is something that indirectly, therefore, contributes to income inequality also on that level within individual countries. Okay.
I welcome your particular targeting of the enablers, because I think that is one of the key tasks ahead of us is to target the enablers and if necessary, increase the sanctions against them, because at the moment the sanctions, as you so rightly say, are so low as not to be a deterrent at all. I'm going to try and fit in another couple of questions. Next one's from Balaji Balagon. Excuse me if I haven't pronounced that correctly. Many thanks for this fascinating talk, Vanessa. In your research, did you find any tax haven activities relating to Central and Eastern Europe, especially during the region's collaborations with Latin America and African countries?
Yeah, thank you so much. That's a fascinating question. And my sense is that you would find a story there, but it would play out more within Europe and it would be related to Switzerland. You would find a story there if you were to sort of look, more in depth in archives that's in East Central Europe and in Swiss archives sort of in a much more targeted way than I was able to do that. You do sort of get a little bit of a glimpse that with the consolidation of Soviet rule over East Central Europe between the end of the Second World War and say 1947, 1948, so within that very short window of time, there is a move of funds out of East Central Europe, especially to Switzerland, by people who are essentially fearing, what the Soviet Union will do once it sort of fully consolidates its control of that part of Europe, and that is something where where I would be willing to say there's not necessarily sort of a full-scale legitimate moral reason for a tax haven to exist, taking into account that kind of scenario that's unfolding there. But that's something where I think it's more understandable and sort of, we can, from the perspective of someone who's moving their funds to Switzerland at this point, we can sort of see more reasons for why to do that, that don't exclusively sort of have to do with a fear of higher taxes, but that also have to do with, a fear of political repression and again, authoritarian control and government in some of these places. So that's one of the exceptions. That's why I said almost no justification for the existence of tax haven. That I would sort of make a small exception there. But that is overall, I think, the East Central Europe story that is there that I haven't investigated as part of my book project because it deals primarily with Western Europe. I haven't come across anything in the developing world. There is a sort of East Central Europe question that plays out again in the late 70s and early 80s in the Eurodollar market, when countries like Poland and others tapped the Eurodollar markets for loans at some point, but that's slightly different and that's not directly related to tax havens.
Thank you. I think we've got time for one more question. A whole load of other questions have come through, and thank you to everyone, but I'm afraid we won't have time to cover them all. But we do have one more question from Suming Ku. Could Professor Ogle comment on any relationship between the rise of tax havens and the frustrated demands at the United Nations by the G77 group for a new international economic order and economic rights duties of states? Very good question, by the way.
Yeah, so that's a great question because it's actually sort of how I initially became interested in this topic. So I was writing an article on the new international economic order, which was a movement by third world countries to basically use the UN apparatus and also UNCTAD and its other sub-organizations to use these structures to basically rein in the powers and the behavior of multinational corporations in these newly independent countries. And what I found when I was writing this article, and this was never meant to be sort of more than just this article, was that one complaint that low-income countries had already in the 1960s and 70s was that multinationals were using transfer pricing and also artificial profit shifting to avoid paying taxes in the developing world. And this is how I basically got interested in tax havens. So while this problem was not at the very top of the sort of list of complaints that low-income countries had and that led them to form the new international economic order, it was certainly an issue that they had identified. And that was sort of part of a bigger set of problems they saw with multinational corporations and how they did business in the global south in particular. So there's definitely a relation in that sense.
Right, well, I think we'll leave it there. And before thanking Vanessa and all the other panelists and contributors today, I'd just like to make a couple of comments. First of all, this conference will resume for its second day tomorrow, and please note the slightly earlier time of 12:15. So that's 12:15 GMT for the second day. And tomorrow's session is going to be looking more at the post-colonial era. We'll be examining the legacies of imperialism and colonialism and discussing what part reparations and taxation might play in remedying the enormous harms that have been caused to the previously colonized countries and their peoples. We'll be starting the session at 12:30 tomorrow with a keynote address on colonial macroeconomics, then and now, from Dr. Ndogo Sambasila. So something to really look, I'm really looking forward to that. So that brings this session, today's session, to an end. But before we all click the leave button, can I ask you to very briefly unmute yourselves and thank Dr. Vanessa Ogle and all the other contributors to the session today in the time-honored fashion by putting your hands together and clapping. So